Larry Sanders' story begins far from the NBA spotlight. He wasn't one of those kids who grew up dribbling a ball from the moment he could walk. In fact, Sanders didn't even start playing organized basketball until late in high school. Born in Fort Pierce, Florida in 1988, his first love wasn't basketball, it was art. He grew up sketching, painting, and expressing himself creatively. He even imagined a future where art might be his career. But at nearly 7 feet tall, fate had other plans. NHI's late start meant he wasn't polished like other prospects, but he had something coaches can't teach: raw length, defensive instincts, and an almost natural sense for protecting the rim. He got noticed at Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, where he became a force in the paint. Sanders wasn't the guy scoring 25 points a night, but he didn't have to be. His energy, rebounding, and shot blocking changed games. At VCU, he helped transform the program into one that demanded national attention, setting the stage for their later Final Four run in 2011. By the time he declared for the NBA draft in 2010, scouts saw him as a project, but a project with incredible upside. NTHE Milwaukee Bucks selected Larry Sanders with the 15th overall pick in the first round. Right away, people had high hopes. The Bucks saw him as a defensive anchor, someone who could intimidate opponents at the rim, protect the paint, and maybe, just maybe, grow into the kind of franchise big man they could build around. NBUT Sanders didn't explode onto the scene right away. His first 2 seasons in Milwaukee were rocky. He was raw, foul-prone, and adjusting to the speed of the NBA. Many young big men struggle in their first years, and Sanders was no exception. At times, it looked like he might end up being a journeyman center, bouncing from roster to roster. And then came the 2012-2013 season. This was the year everything changed. Sanders finally put it all together. He averaged almost a double-double, 9.8 points, 9.5 rebounds, and ranked second in the league in blocked shots with 2.8 per game. He had nights where he completely shut down opposing stars, rejecting shots left and right. On November 30, 2012, he posted a triple-double against the Minnesota Timberwolves, 10 points, 12 rebounds, and an incredible 10 blocks. It was the kind of performance that makes fans and analysts say, "This guy could be special." Suddenly, Larry Sanders wasn't just another young big man. He was being talked about as the future of Milwaukee's defense, the perfect complement to a young forward the Bucks had just drafted named Giannis Antetokounmpo. The vision was clear: Giannis as the athletic, versatile forward and Sanders as the rim-protecting center behind him. Together, they could have been one of the most dangerous defensive duos in the NBA, and fans in Milwaukee loved him. He was fiery, passionate, and wore his emotions on his sleeve. Sanders would scream after a block, pound his chest after an alley-oop dunk, and bring energy every single night. He embodied the kind of grit that blue-collar Milwaukee fans admired. And by the summer of 2013, the Bucks were convinced he was their long-term answer at center. They signed him to a 4-year, $44 million contract extension. At just 24 years old, he had gone from a late-blooming project to one of the most promising defensive bigs in the league. The future seemed bright. Larry Sanders looked like he was on track to become a franchise cornerstone alongside Giannis and NBUT. As quickly as the rise came, the fall was right around the corner. By the start of the 2013-2014 NBA season, Larry Sanders was no longer just a role player fighting for minutes. He was the face of Milwaukee's future. The Bucks had invested heavily in him with that 4-year, $44 million contract, and expectations skyrocketed overnight. NFOR, a 24-year-old who had only been playing basketball for a few years, the pressure was immense. The franchise saw him as their defensive anchor, the guy who would protect the paint for years, mentor Giannis, and bring credibility to a small-market team fighting for relevance. Fans wanted production. The front office wanted results. And the media was watching closely to see if Sanders could live up to the hype. At first, the money seemed like a blessing. But for Sanders, it became a double-edged sword. While other players celebrated the deal, he later admitted that the weight of the contract felt like chains around his neck. The more money he made, the more pressure he felt to perform, and the less joy he found in the game. Then came the off-court issues. In the fall of 2013, just weeks after signing his extension, Sanders got into a fight at a Milwaukee nightclub. Reports said it turned into a brawl, with Sanders allegedly throwing bottles. The incident left him with an injured thumb that required surgery, sidelining him for 6 weeks. For the Bucks, it was a disaster. Their new $44 million man wasn't just missing games, he was making headlines for the wrong reasons, and fans were frustrated. The media was critical. And for Sanders, the negative attention only made his relationship with basketball more complicated. The game that once gave him identity and opportunity was now tied to scrutiny, judgment, and disappointment. NBUT, the trouble didn't end there. Sanders soon faced multiple suspensions for violating the NBA's anti-drug policy after testing positive for marijuana. At the time, the league treated marijuana as a banned substance, and Sanders quickly developed a reputation as someone who couldn't stay out of trouble. Critics labeled him a wasted talent, while others dismissed him as just another young athlete who didn't take his career seriously. What most people didn't know, however, was that Sanders was struggling with mental health challenges. Behind the scenes, he was battling anxiety, depression, and a deep sense of emptiness that no contract or on-court success could fix. Basketball had never been his true passion. Remember, he'd discovered it late in life. For him, the game was always more of a path than a purpose. In interviews years later, Sanders admitted that basketball wasn't something he loved. It was something he did because he was good at it, and because it gave him a future. But once the fame, money, and pressure were added, the spark that kept him going disappeared. Nay, and teammates noticed the shift. Coaches noticed it too. Sanders, once the emotional heartbeat of the Bucks, seemed disconnected. His play suffered, his injuries piled up, and the trust between him and the organization eroded. NBY 2014, the Bucks' grand vision of pairing Sanders with Giannis was already collapsing. What was supposed to be a long-term partnership began to look like a failed experiment. While Giannis worked tirelessly to improve, Sanders was slipping further away from the game mentally and emotionally. And then came the breaking point. In early 2015, at just 26 years old, Larry Sanders made a shocking decision. He wanted to walk away from the NBA entirely. He wasn't being forced out. He wasn't cut. He wasn't injured beyond recovery. He simply decided that basketball was no longer for him. NTO made that choice. Sanders did something almost unheard of. He gave back money. From his $44 million contract, he returned around $15 million to the Bucks in a buyout agreement. That meant leaving behind financial security that most players would cling to at all costs. For Sanders, the message was clear. His peace of mind was worth more than money, fame, or even an NBA career. And at first, the news shocked the basketball world. How could a player in his prime, with such a massive contract, just walk away? Fans didn't understand. Analysts criticized him. Some even called him a quitter. NBUT Sanders knew something they didn't. Basketball was breaking him from the inside. He needed to step away before the game consumed him completely. This was the beginning of one of the most unusual retirements in NBA history. An athlete leaving millions on the table, not for another league or career move, but for something much harder to explain: mental health, healing, and family. In February of 2015, the news hit like an earthquake. Larry Sanders was done with basketball. NHE was only 26 years old. He still had years left on his contract. The Bucks had invested millions into him. And yet, instead of fighting through, Sanders chose the unthinkable. He asked for a buyout. Most athletes, when they walk away, do it because their body gives out. Bad knees, a torn Achilles, a career-ending injury. But Sanders wasn't broken physically. He was broken mentally and emotionally. NFOR, him. Basketball had stopped being an outlet and had become a burden. He described the game as something that no longer brought him joy, but instead triggered anxiety and depression. His identity as Larry Sanders, NBA player, felt like a mask, something that no longer matched who he really was inside. When he finalized the buyout with Milwaukee, he gave back nearly $15 million of his contract. Think about that for a second. Millions of dollars willingly left on the table. In the NBA, where money and status often define success, Sanders' move was unheard of. NTHE League, the media, and the fans didn't know how to process it. Some called him a coward. Others said he wasted his talent. Sports radio hosts accused him of quitting on his teammates. Social media, as always, was even harsher. Memes and jokes painted him as the guy who chose weed over basketball, mocking the marijuana suspensions that had already damaged his reputation. NBUT behind the noise, the reality was much deeper. Sanders wasn't just leaving basketball, he was trying to save himself. Shortly after stepping away, he checked into a mental health treatment facility. It wasn't for injuries. It wasn't for rehab after a fight. It was for anxiety, depression, and mood disorders. He later explained in interviews that he had been living with a constant cloud over his head, feeling suffocated by expectations, fame, and the spotlight that came with the NBA. Sanders admitted that marijuana was part of how he coped. While the league punished him for it, he saw it as a form of self-medication. For him, it was a way to calm the storm inside his head, even if it cost him suspensions and criticism. Years later, as attitudes toward marijuana and professional sports shifted, many began to view Sanders' story differently, not as a tale of wasted talent, but as an early sign of how little space the NBA gave athletes to address mental health. Still, in 2015, Sanders' decision was rare and misunderstood. The NBA wasn't yet having open conversations about mental health. Players weren't posting about therapy or anxiety. There wasn't much room for vulnerability. And so Sanders' retirement looked less like bravery and more like abandonment to the outside world. NBUT for Sanders, it was liberation. NHE spoke openly in a Players Tribune video, explaining his choice. He didn't talk about money or contracts. He talked about peace of mind. He talked about needing time for himself, for his family, for his children. He admitted that basketball was never his true love. It had given him opportunities, yes, but it wasn't the thing that defined him. And for him, stepping away, wasn't quitting. It was survival. And yet, survival came at a cost. He lost his place in the NBA. His name disappeared from highlight reels. The Bucks moved forward with Giannis as their centerpiece. Analysts stopped debating his potential and started labeling him as a cautionary tale. NBUT, in stepping away, Sanders planted a seed. He became one of the first NBA players to publicly prioritize mental health over money and fame. His choice foreshadowed a shift in the league. Years later, stars like Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan would openly speak about depression and anxiety, and the NBA itself would launch new initiatives around player wellness. In a way, Sanders was ahead of his time. NHE wasn't perfect. His story wasn't clean or polished. But it was real. He showed the world that athletes aren't machines. They aren't just contracts and stats. They're human beings with battles invisible to the cameras. NFOR Sanders. Walking away from basketball wasn't the end of his story. It was the start of something else. Music, art, family, and a search for meaning beyond the court were waiting. But before all that, he had to face the fallout of his decision, the isolation, the criticism, and the uncertainty of life after basketball. This was the hardest part, living with the world's judgment while trying to heal in private. When Larry Sanders walked away from the NBA in 2015, it wasn't just a career move. It was a reset button on his entire life. For nearly a decade, basketball had dictated his schedule, his identity, and even his happiness. Suddenly, all of that was gone. No more practices, no more cameras, no more endless pressure to perform, but also no more structure, no more guaranteed paychecks, and no clear path forward. NFOR. Many players, retirement, especially unexpected retirement, can feel like freefall. And for Sanders, those first years were exactly that. He was adjusting to being just another guy, no longer Larry Sanders, the NBA player, but Larry Sanders, the father, the artist, the man trying to figure out who he really was outside of the game. Art and music, a different kind of creativity. One of the first places Sanders turned to was art. Long before he picked up a basketball, Sanders had an eye for painting and drawing. During his NBA career, he'd often sketch in notebooks during downtime, creating abstract pieces that reflected his emotions. After leaving the league, he began to pour his energy into painting full-time, even exhibiting some of his work publicly. NBUT, it wasn't just visual art. Music became another outlet. Sanders started recording under the name L8 Show, producing tracks that blended hip-hop and alternative sounds. It wasn't about chasing fame or becoming the next big star. For him, music was therapy, a way to express what words couldn't capture in interviews or press conferences. NTHE Public at first didn't quite understand. To them, it looked like Sanders had traded dunks and rebounds for beats and canvases. Critics laughed, calling it a midlife crisis at 26. But to those close to him, it was clear. This was a man finally chasing passions that basketball had kept buried for years. Family and healing off the stage and away from the spotlight, Sanders was focused on something even more personal: his family. He had young children at the time, and stepping away from the NBA meant he could finally be present. No more being gone 82 nights a year. No more summer schedules dictated by training camps and workouts. Instead, he could show up for birthdays, school days, and small everyday moments that had always been sacrificed for the game. This was a huge part of why he left. He'd said it in his Players' Tribune message, that his kids needed him more than the Bucks did. And in many ways, this decision redefined him not as a player, but as a father who chose his children over fame. NTHE attempted comeback still. The pull of the game never completely vanished. In 2017, 2 years after his exit, Sanders attempted a comeback. The Cleveland Cavaliers, led by LeBron James at the time, gave him a shot. The hope was that he could provide rim protection and depth for a playoff run. NBUT, it didn't last. Sanders had been away from the game too long, and the adjustment was brutal. His conditioning wasn't the same, and the Cavs only gave him a brief look before cutting ties. For Sanders, it was confirmation that his chapter in the NBA had truly closed. NHE later admitted that his heart wasn't fully in the comeback. The passion for the game simply wasn't there anymore. Basketball had been a tool, a career, but it was never his great love. And forcing himself back into it only reminded him why he left in the first place. Legacy. More than basketball. Today, when fans look back on Larry Sanders, they don't remember him for all-star games or championships. They remember the story of the young center who walked away in his prime. At first, it was framed as failure, wasted potential. But over time, as the NBA started to embrace conversations about mental health, Sanders' decision began to look more courageous. And players like Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, and Paul George later spoke openly about their battles with anxiety and depression. And the NBA responded by investing in mental wellness programs. Sanders didn't start that movement single-handedly, but he was one of the first to put his career on the line to protect his peace of mind. In that sense, his legacy is bigger than basketball. He showed that success isn't always measured in stats, rings, or millions. Sometimes success is choosing yourself, even if the world doesn't understand. Sanders' art and music continue to grow, but more importantly, his story continues to inspire athletes who feel trapped by the weight of expectation. He proved that it's possible to step away, to reinvent, to live life on your own terms. NTHE final word: Larry Sanders may not have had the career fans once imagined. He may not be remembered alongside the greats of his generation. But in a way, his story is more human, more relatable. He was a man who had everything the NBA could offer: money, fame, a platform, and realized it wasn't enough. NHE traded it all for peace. And in doing so, he became a symbol of something far more important than basketball: the courage to put your mental health first.